Good afternoon, everyone. Buenas tardes. I think we have some people joining us via Zoom, so everything is quite formal in terms of the proceedings as well, so that we bring everyone in this hybrid way. It's my great pleasure today to introduce Professor Ivàn Ramos. And the way that we will run this today is that I'll introduce Professor Ivàn Ramos. There'll be about a 30-minute talk on the book itself. I'll give more formal comments in response to the book, and then we'll sit and just open up to the audience for questions, engagement, whatever thoughts you may have. So thank you so much for being here today. So Ivàn A. Ramos is assistant professor in the Department of Theater Arts and Performance Studies here at Brown University. He received his PhD in performance studies with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality studies from UC Berkeley. Professor Ramos's broader research investigates the links and slippages between transnational Latino American aesthetics in relationship to the everydayness of contemporary and historical violence. In particular, he is interested in how the aesthetic may provide a way to engage with an ethics of difference. His work brings together performance studies, queer and feminist theory, Latino-OX American studies, and media and film studies, and he is currently at work on a second book manuscript tentatively titled Mourning Without Bodies. His first book that we celebrate today is Unbelonging, Dissonant Sounds. No, it's now Inauthentic Sounds in Mexican and Latinx Aesthetics, and it's published by NYU Press. This is the first public talk on the book. His work has been supported by fellowships from the University of California Humanities Research Institute, the National Humanities Center, and the Ford Foundation. In addition, Professor Ramos was awarded a 2023 Mellon Emerging Faculty Leaders Award from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, formerly the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Ivàn is originally from Tijuana, Mexico. So this is the book that we're celebrating. You see it there, Unbelonging, Inauthentic Sounds in Mexican and Latinx Aesthetics. Please join me in welcoming its author, Ivàn Ramos.
So first of all, I want to thank the CSREA. I feel like I've been, they've hosted me every year since before I started here. And so every year I've had the opportunity to be in conversation. And I've been very lucky to be a part of the work that the CSREA is doing. And I want to thank Trisha Rose, Stephanie LaRue, Ellie Winter, Trey Alton Swan, Callum Aldrich, and I hope I'm not missing anyone. I also want to thank Professor Gomez-Barris for agreeing to be in conversation with me today. We've known each other for a long time, so it's very meaningful to get to this moment. And I want to thank all of you for being here. My psyche tends to be in equal measure, having been raised as a particular kind of Catholic Franciscan piety and a Sontagian anti-sentimentality. So I'm trying to actually embrace the moment and like feel it. And so it's very nice and wonderful to see everybody here. And I know the people who are on Zoom. Also, I'm going to do a little ad before I get started, but thanks to Professor Alvarado, Jesus Alemando, the artist who I was very fortunate to get for the book cover, who will be here later in the semester in November, I believe, and so we'll get a chance to be in conversation about her work. And so, yeah, so I'll just add that although I consider myself very lucky to have found a home with so many amazing colleagues, students, undergrad and grad students here, and staff during my still short time here at Brown, I'm also going to give a little special shout out to Letty, who actually was the person who really, proposed the book for the book series, and it has been also really good. Her and Patty have been really good at being like, just embrace it, just be in the spotlight, like don't be shy. And so, yeah, so I will start, I'll wait a little bit, yes, perfect, okay. So before I read from the book, I want to do a little bit of framing around a couple of things that I have encountered just this year, and those that couldn't have made it into the book. But before I get there, over the last week, I couldn't help but remember, as I was about to send the book to the press, I was in a meeting with the wonderful scholar of trans studies, Jules Jill Peterson. And I mentioned to her, like, oh my gosh, I'm sending out the book, it's so nerve-wracking. And she mentioned, like when I sent my book out, my first feeling was, what if it's all lies? And so you've read Histories of the Transgender Child, and you know that's a rigorous, wonderful, brilliant book. You know that like that couldn't have been the case, but it gave me a little bit of at least sense that it's okay to feel that way. So my book focuses primarily on a collection of Mexican Latinx artists that I argue use what I call dissonant sounds in order to resist or reject the terms of neoliberal belonging that became attached to the right to claim citizenship in the aftermath of a number of reforms stretching from the mid-'80s to the 1990s. And I'll go into that when I read from the intro. These sounds were considered dissonant because they did not appear to conform to what we might apprehend as Mexican or Latinx sounds, or what we would expect music produced by Mexican or Latinx musicians to sound like. In particular, the book traces how music genres such as rock, punk, metal, British rock from the 80s, etc., were seen as culturally incompatible as they began to reach or were practiced by Mexican and Latinx subjects. So for example, as rock and roll became popular in Mexico in the 50s and 60s, mainstream Mexican culture followed a guidebook of anxieties about the corruption of the youth. Men would let their hair grow long. They would abandon their families. They would become effeminate. Women would copy an Americanized style and start wearing short skirts, would start becoming promiscuous. And so, alongside this, the fear that these teenagers would eventually reject their national and cultural identity. These panics grew even larger as rock changed and it moved from its original middle-class listeners to the working class, who were less afraid of embracing fears of betraying their national heritage, and in fact had turned to rock and its heavier sounds precisely because it was a kind of music that allowed them to protest the kind of image of Mexicanidad that the government aimed to promote, particularly in the aftermath of the Tlatelolco massacre of '68 and the Corpus Christi massacre of '71, both of which targeted a young working class coming into political consciousness. In the United States, I show that during this time span into the present, Latinx populations have been most legible in moments when Latino sounds and artists have become popular, from the conga drums of Desi Arnaz to the salsa rhythms of Celia Cruz, to the Latinized pop of Ricky Martin, Jennifer Lopez, and Shakira. In this case, the crossover appeal of Latino sounds in the American mainstream that reoccur every few years are inevitably accompanied by proclamations that such popular embrace is proof that Latinos are now part of an American sonic tapestry. And more importantly, no longer foreigners, but integrated citizens whose music has earned them the right to belong. So given that these are the central arguments that set up just why these dissonant sounds and the subcultures they fostered were so important and could be used in subversive ways by the artists that I examine in the book, I couldn't help but be relieved first by an image I encountered during my last trip to Mexico this past January. So this is a photograph of Las Rockeras, a villainous group in Mexican lucha libre, or wrestling, that were active in the 80s and 90s. And so most of the examples in the book that refer to the cultural panic and disciplining that women listening to rock came from what we might call elite or upper class, and thus nationalistic commentators. But this was the first example that I have found of the extent to which what we might call rockeras or punqueras were part of a larger Mexican cultural imaginary. Las Rockeras fell under the category of rudas, or in English wrestling term, heels, aka the kind of overdramatic villains that the audience boos. I also want to point out their uniquely masculine demeanor, which was also the result that as rock music moved from the middle class to the working class, the idea that followed was that young women would in fact become masculinized, disrespectful, and basically rude. And there's no panic like the panic that can be provoked by a bad daughter in a Mexican context. And so in the case of Latinx example, just last week I came across a story in Time magazine about the major controversy involving funding for the Smithsonian's planned National Museum of the American Latino. Over the last 2 years, the curators from the museum had been planning for the inaugural exhibit to focus on the history of Latino civil rights movements, with a focus on the history of Latinx activism in the US, focusing on student movements, worker strikes, immigration activism, etc. However, conservative funders from the private sector threatened to pull back promised funding, and this past summer, Republican Latino politicians banded together in Congress to vote to defund the museum if it intended to proceed with this exhibit. And I'll quote the Times article here, quote, "If conservatives are serious about culture wars, they should definitely defund this museum," says Alfonso Aguilar, the president of the Latino Partnership for Conservative Politics, or Conservative Principles, end quote. So instead, the Smithsonian has confirmed that a new exhibit is currently being developed to replace this original one, focused on the history of Latin music in America. And I'll quote briefly from the article again, quote, "When asked why he switched the focus of the next preview exhibit from Latino youth movements to salsa, the museum's director, Jorge Samanillo, said the music exhibit would, quote, have broader appeal. I need to think about how we're going to cover over 100,000 square feet of public exhibition space in a future museum. How do I fill that? What stories do I have that can tell, that can get to that broader appeal?" So going back to my argument, this was just more proof that the story of Latinx people in the US is a celebratory one of integration, best told through their culturally harmonious musical legacies. And so, although I wish I could keep editing this book, and I kept joking that each time I got to another draft, I found the draft that I wish I had another 5 years to work on. At the very least, encounters like this give me a sense that the arguments that underlie the book in the work that I attempt to do in it not only hold, but as in the case of the National Museum of the American Latino, continue to make certain sounds and histories dissonant. So now I'll read a little bit from the book's introduction, and if I have time, I'll try to get to the coda in a second. But I'll try to give you a sense of the book. It's very exciting, reading from the book for the first time. Let's see, and so this is from the introduction, and it's the very beginning. El Tianguis Cultural del Chopo, one of Mexico City's many street markets, is a veritable paradise for fans of rock and its many subgenres. Begun in the 1980s in response to Mexico City's widespread ban on the distribution and live performance of rock music during the 70s, this punk rock flea market currently occupies a side street next to the Jose Vasconcelos Library every Saturday. Across its 2 narrow corridors, visitors can find innumerable stalls selling bootleg CDs and DVDs of rock, punk, and metal bands, as well as cult films and pirated merchandises, from band t-shirts to bongs and lighters. One can also find stands dedicated to the promotion of anarchist politics, veganism, and even an authorized recording of talks by leftist icons like Michel Foucault and Noam Chomsky. And they have on DVD, they have the Chomsky-Foucault debate in multiple stalls. When one end of the market, the side that leads from the main cross street to the stands, dealers loudly and whisper offers of marijuana, cocaine, and ecstasy to passersby. At the other end of the market, past the majority of the stalls, a parking lot becomes the site of a stage where ragtag bands comprised of people ranging from teenagers to scene veterans perform aggressive sounds, especially punk and metal, as ambling crowds pay varying levels of attention. This market, one of the geographic protagonists of this book, is emblematic of the alternative sonic subcultures of Mexican and Latino listeners. Often it's affected young people who have found their traditional national and ethnic cultures insufficiently equipped to respond to their sense of alienation. Getting to this market, however, sometimes proves a needlessly complicated journey. On more than one occasion, cab drivers have refused to drop me off at the entrance of the market. Sure, they might be confusing it with the Museo Universitario del Chopo, an art museum just a few blocks away, and the original home of the market, a friendlier destination. And indeed, multiple acquaintances who live in the city have expressed concern when I tell them that I plan to spend a Saturday traversing the market, alarmed by its almost mythological, if misplaced, notoriety as a dangerous gathering place for derelicts and rejects of Mexico City's middle class, despite my assurances that I have never felt even once unsafe there. In fact, ever since my first visit to El Mercado del Chopo in the early 2000s, I have felt a sense of mutual recognition. Sure, my lighter skin and Americanized comportment make me stand out, but the space is welcoming, and there's always someone ready to talk with me about some obscure punk band or the benefits of a vegan diet. There's a shared feeling of being outside the space of legibility from the rest of the city. This feeling of being outside of the legible bounds of belonging is hardly unique to this place. I have felt it across other moments in punk rock bars in Tijuana, Morrissey tribute nights in Los Angeles, and 80s British rock nights in Chicago, to name a few. In all these cases, a significant number, and often the majority of the attendees, can be identified by the demographic moniker of Mexican or Latino. And there is a recognition of the kinds of reactions that our listening to these sounds tends to create, a lingering sense that our presence there makes us illegible, incommensurable with the typical white listeners who are in the spaces. In other words, the racial break produced by the imagined difference between certain kinds of brown bodies and certain kinds of white sounds has made us outsiders. Unbelonging takes these moments of shared illegibility as opportunities to examine the intersections of sound, culture, and politics in relation to a sonic history that, while focused on the late 80s and moves across the 90s and into the 2000s, stretches back to graze the 60s and 70s and forward onto the present. So this book aims to reformulate prototypical understandings of national and ethnic belonging and long-standing lineages of what Mexicanidad and Latinidad sound like, in turn arguing that these modes of illegibility enable what I see as crucial modes of refusal. I identify the sense of outsiderdom as unbelonging, the embrace of a shared sense of illegibility, a collectivity of outsiders that is the result of their being perceived as inauthentic Mexicans or Latinos. Primarily due to these subjects' adherence to what I call dissonant sounds. These dissonant sounds are sonic forms that stand at a remove from the demands and expectations of national and ethnic mainstream cultures that seek to dictate what an authentic and proper Mexican or Latino subject should listen to. I am particularly interested in the subcultural spaces and unofficial forms of circulation that these listeners move across and within, and especially in the essential, if often unacknowledged, influence these movements have had on the realm of contemporary Mexican and Latino art practice, a side which I argue has been central to articulating the political and aesthetic promises of these subcultures and these sounds. Unbelonging examines the relationship between unbelonging, inauthenticity, and sonic dissonance to investigate how a number of Mexican and Latino artists who mostly began working in the late 80s and early 1990s deployed a dissonant relationship to incongruous sonic forms as a mode of turning away from a number of historical, political, economic, and cultural orthodoxies in Mexico and the United States that have a fixed belonging to one's national and ethnic identification. Sorry, I lost my place again. The following chapters linger on the incongruity or dissonance between transnational Latinidad and certain kinds of sounds, attending to the gestures of refusal they enable. I place these moments of refusal in the context of larger questions of citizenship and belonging in the space defined by the political, economic, and cultural relationship between Mexico and the United States, particularly in the time of neoliberalism, i.e. between the early 1980s and 2015, and that's the span that the book covers in terms of both the artist and the temporality of the scenes that I discuss. I anchor this book with an analysis of a set of tendencies in contemporary Mexican and Latino art that make use of sonic dissonance to develop gestures of refusal against changing notions of citizenship, challenging what it means to feel a sense of belonging in, to, and between the two countries. Just skip ahead. And so, something that I want to point about these artists is that although they are inseparable from larger political events, they do not make political art. This is not to say that these artists are not astutely aware of the high stakes of the political context in which their work was made. But this work just does not respond directly to these events. As a result of this, while artists like Nahuel Bustamante, Sara Minter, or Xiu Salamando certainly have a politics in their work, they are rarely considered political artists. As I argue in chapter 1, one of the major factors in the rapid emergence of the ongoing popularity of sound art in Mexico was the fact that this form allowed artists to move away from the constant expectation to create work that explicitly engaged with national histories and politics. And so the main framing that I use in the book, or the main theoretical contribution, I hope, is the sense this notion of unbelonging that I tried to develop in the introduction and across the chapters. And so, unbelonging not only risks inauthenticity, it welcomes it. The subjects, artists, and subcultures in each of the chapters in the book reject any notion of the authentic in their choice of records or in their behavior, and even in their proficiency with instruments or as listeners. I theorize alongside their rejection, understanding instead that authenticity is often a demand that always keeps its resolution at bay. For those of us listening, this does not simply mean turning away from global capital's ability to appropriate customs, sounds, and objects for middle-class consumption, but rather returning our understanding of the notion as always already deployed by the logics of capital. To reject authenticity is, like rejecting citizenship, to negate the value of a concept used to entrap subjects into the stable identities required to make consumption legible. After all, who gains from the imagined need for authentic Mexican goods more than the middle-class American consumers, who are in turn able to show off their ability to recognize and show them as such? On the other hand, subjects in the global south who continuously purchase or make use of unsanctioned, pirated, or bootlegged objects are imagined by the logic of consumerism as fooled by the ever-haunting specter of commodity fetishism, unable to turn successfully away from the lures of capital. But the originality or authenticity, the aura perhaps, of the commodity that speaks is itself a fiction of a Western project that violently managed to colonize and subject much of the world by appealing to this very logic, to the authenticity of its values and epistemologies, while dismissing the rest of the globe as an inauthentic place that would one day arrive at enlightenment or modernity by following Western teleological narratives of progress. And so one of the ways in which I handle after the book is that in each chapter, there's a different mode of a bootleg or an inauthentic object that I examine. And I'll walk to some of those in a second. And so I arrange the unbelonging subjects and inauthentic objects of unbelonging across 4 chapters, each focused on an act of turning away or refusing a particular political, cultural, or economic development. The first 2 chapters are set in Mexico during a period ranging from about 1989 to 2015. They investigate the influence dissonant sounds had on the contemporary art scene, focusing specifically on sound art and punk and metal. In the first chapter, I look at the work of the Cuban-Mexican artist Ivàn Ramos to situate sound art as one of the most important categories of distribution and aesthetic inquiry. I show that sound art in its many forms became prevalent in Mexican contemporary art over the past few decades because it freed artists from having to continuously engage with the historical relationship between artistic practice and the political stakes of Mexicanidad. I delve into one of Abreu's most important and striking works, MRPM, or Mass in the Function of Revolutions per Minute, in which nationalist recordings are reproduced through the medium of ice. And so what you're seeing is an ice record, which if you have a silicone mold, you fill it with water, you freeze it. The water maintains the information in the grooves, and so you can actually play it on a turntable. I follow the strange history of ice and transnational commerce in the Americas to suggest that through the ice vinyl, Abreu performs a trenchant critique of revolution and its historical proximity to teleology. I insist that sound art's ability to experiment with form and objects provides a refusal of the logics of the market. The second chapter traces the impact of metal and punk subcultures in the economically dispossessed edges of Mexico City, and in particular their adoption by female listeners, who took to these sounds to defy conventional expectations. I show that as these sonic subcultures were criminalized, the appropriation of space was essential in the development of a new contemporary art scene where feminist artists thrived. This chapter examines the early work of the artist collective Semefo, which is the strip of actions to the left, actually to your right, I think. I then look at the video work of Sarah Minter and her 1989 feature-length video, I'm a Punk, to argue that against the lack of archival resources, emergent aesthetic forms were responsible for capturing the legacy of scenes where young women made use of aggression to articulate feminist dissatisfaction. I map how their refusal crafts a new vocabulary that reframes not only prevalent histories of Mexican contemporary art, but also the ways in which they played the minor courts of economic dispossession to reject the political promises of NAFTA. And NAFTA is one of the other kind of main protagonists of the book as I trace how NAFTA in particular had a provision to be able to prosecute bootlegs in Latin America, Mexico in particular. The final two chapters cross the border into the United States, where I follow the Chicana lesbian punk and the Latino Morrissey fan during the years of the Latino boom. First, I examine the cultural fascination with the figure of the Chicana punk, and in particular the Chicana lesbian punk, across a variety of media to show how this figure provides a sonic alternative that allows Chicanas to experience desire and pleasure against the demands of culturally dictated familial duties. I look at the short life of the mariachi punk band Las Cucas, led by performance artist Now Bustamante, to find how the performance of lesbian desire exemplifies the Chicana punk's ability to turn away from motherhood as the defining feature of Chicana female existence. I propose that the Chicana punk's refusal to be imagined as a caretaker opens new avenues for exploring and experiencing an abject yet pleasurable form of Chicana subjectivity. And finally, I delve into the fervent Latino fan base that has spread around the British artist Morrissey since the 1990s. I move away from the social cultural explanations of this fandom and attempt to make sense of it by finding legible points of proximity between Morrissey's sound and Latino culture. I argue that listening to Morrissey, as well as other British artists like The Cure, Depeche Mode, and Susie and the Banshees, to name a few, give Latino listeners the opportunity to create new social relations rooted in depression and a sense of cultural and economic dispossession. I conclude the chapter with a detailed look at the drawings of the Chicana Japanese artist Chiso Salamando and her rendering of these Latino Morrissey listeners through the scene of friendship, an ethics of relationality that refuses to be grounded in the celebratory vocabulary of Latinidad and ethnic belonging. The reject in this chapter thus listens to Morrissey and other 80s British artists to negate the demands of ethnic legibility at a time when mainstream politics sought inclusion through sonic consumption of legible Latino sounds. And the other image from Salamando, which is on the bedsheets, the green image, was almost the other book cover, which I was very sad to let go of, but ultimately I couldn't say no to this. And so, Unbelonging proposes that holding something like Muñoz's brown commons together is ultimately a communal act. And each of my case studies dwells within the uneasiness of the commons while landing on the potential of an alternative and yet to be explored solidarities. What emerges throughout is an attempt, fragile by nature, to seek alternatives to the siren call of belonging by relying together on another who could listen past the fog of history and politics to hear others who felt like them, like us. I hope that in the following pages, in the memory of a song or in the discovery of an artist, you, the reader, might glean moments of recognition and share, even if only in the space of a short track, the pleasurable rewards of unbelonging. And yeah, I'll just stop there. Yeah, I mean, unbelonging comes from my ambivalence about what it means to be integrated, right? It's kind of like, is it the Groucho Marx quote? I would never want to belong to a club that would have me as a member. But thinking about like, yeah, how those violences gonna come to be, coming from the border, and even as somebody who, I'm a permanent resident but not a US citizen, and I don't know if there's a psychic thing that stops me from doing it, from getting my citizenship, even though I could. But yeah, like that sense of, there are framings of belonging that I just always make me uncomfortable. And that always, so the coda actually ends on To See Max say, which is a super rock star group out of Mexico that performs Mexicanized versions of Morrissey songs. And so I went to see them at BAM, and I was with Summer, Kim Lee, and Leon Halton, and they turned to me, and they were like, "You're cringing, like you look so uncomfortable right now," because the band was trying to be, I remember at one point the lead singer was like, "Why are you all sitting down? Mexicans dance, and tonight we're all Mexicans." And thinking of like, oh, okay, like the actual ethos that I care about has been absorbed. And the moment in which I should have felt that sense oh, here I am, right? Here's this thing that I love. Like, here's the identity, like perfectly synchronized. Made me really uncomfortable just because it had to lose something in order to become legible. And I think that's what it is. What can we, how do we remain illegible when that is the thing that we're being asked to always perform, especially as racialized subjects? And so, yeah.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying because I think right now there is a lot of discomfort with the category, as you said, Latino, and I think part of it is that how do we figure out a path forward, right? And I think methodologically you're doing that, as I mentioned, but discomfort, unbelonging, the inauthentic, all of these ways, the kind of counterintuitive formulations, the bad feelings, et cetera. I think you did that so well. So
Thank
you
you
everyone
all.
for being here. Let's applaud you.
Thank you.